It's okay with everyone. We will turn the recording off when we get to the Q&A session. Okay, so welcome everyone. I'm Rebecca Jennings. I'll be chairing this evening's seminar. I'm really delighted to welcome you all to this evening's seminar, which very appropriately for Lesbian Visibility Day is entitled "Who Needs a Lesbian Past?" Our speakers this evening are Liz Millwood and Noah Littel. I will introduce them both in a minute, but first just to explain how the seminar is going to be organised this evening. So each speaker will speak for 20 minutes, and then once they finish speaking, we will move to a discussion and Q&A session. If you think of any questions while they're talking, please feel free to put them in the chat or make a note of them, and we'll get to those questions as soon as the speakers have finished. So if I can introduce our speakers, we will first be hearing from Noah Littel. Noah is a PhD candidate at Maastricht University. Their research focuses on the history of LGBT+ archives in the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, and West Germany from the 1970s. This PhD project is part of a broader project, The Critical Visitor: Intersectional Approaches for Rethinking and Retooling Accessibility and Inclusivity in Heritage Spaces. Noah recently developed an exhibition on this history called The Archive in Progress, which was hosted by Adrienne and Ilya in Amsterdam from December 2021 to May 2022. So really looking forward to hearing from Noah. And then our second speaker is Liz Millwood. Liz Millwood is Professor of Women's and Gender Studies at the University of Manitoba. She's the author of Making a Scene, Lesbians and Community Across Canada 1964 to 84, and co-author with Janice G. Jodd and Irene Fabara-Manuel of Killing Off the Lesbians, A Symbolic Annihilation on Film and Television. Her first book, Women in British Imperial Airspace, also won the Canadian Women's Studies Association Annual Book Prize. So I'm looking forward to very much to hearing from both Noah and Liz. And I'm going to hand over now to Noah, who's going to get us started with their paper, Constructing a Lesbian Past.
Thanks very much. I'll just load my screen, just a second. All right, well, thanks very much for the introduction and for having me. So today I will be highlighting one of the case studies for my PhD research. As Rebecca said, I researched the history of LGBT+ archives in the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, and West Germany from the 1970s onwards. And in this research project, I studied the prehistory and emergence of these archives and followed their development throughout the 1980s and 1990s. Specifically, I analyzed processes of inclusion and exclusion in archival practices. Decisions on who and what to include were often made explicitly in ideological goals formulated by archival staff, but also implicitly in daily practices based on the preferences of archival staff. Areas of interest in these explicit and implicit processes of selection are, for instance, how lesbian and gay archives dealt with topics that were heavily debated within the lesbian and gay movement. For instance, I look at how the lesbian feminist sex wars have impacted archival choices in the lesbian archives. Here, the comparison between national contexts is very important, as the sex wars played a different role in the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, and Germany. Additionally, I look at how implicit and explicit archival choices around inclusion have impacted archival representation of marginalized communities within the women's and lesbian and gay movement, such as people of color, Jewish people, and disabled people. With this, I also aim to show the longer institutional history of thinking about inclusivity and diversity in alternative heritage institutes. I'm currently in the beginning of the third year of my PhD. So far, I've done the majority of the research on the Dutch case study, which has consisted of going through organizational archival material and an oral history approach. Later this year, we'll be starting with the comparative aspect of this research. For today's seminar, I will be talking specifically about how Dutch lesbian archives constructed the lesbian history in their collection policies, both by finding lesbian kinship in the past, as well as by collecting from their own contemporary lesbian movement. In 1981, the lesbian feminist magazine Leeuwarden published an article by prominent Dutch lesbian feminist Maaike Meijer about her visit to the Lesbian Herstory Archives in New York. Meijer lamented the absence of such an initiative in the Netherlands. She said, quote, "You know the vices and habits of your own lesbian tribe, but you don't know how the lesbian tribes of 20, 30, 50 years ago lived. Nobody is conserving lesbian culture. Nobody is remembering our traditions, at least not in the Netherlands." End of quote. This was not entirely true. A lesbian archive already existed in Leeuwarden, a city in Friesland, in the north of the Netherlands, in the home of Henny Smith. However, this archive was not yet open to the public. Meijer's article increased the interest in lesbian archives, and in 1982, a group of around 70 women met up to discuss the subject. They did not discuss whether a lesbian archive should come into existence, but rather discuss the shape it should take when it would. Would there need to be several regional archives or one national one? Would the archive need to be housed in a safe lesbian environment of someone's private address, or in a communal women's house, or in a public library? Would the address need to be kept secret or be known publicly? And would the archive need to be open to men? In order to keep materials available regionally, the initiators decided to set up several regional archives in Leeuwarden, Nijmegen, Utrecht, Amsterdam, Den Bosch, and later in Eindhoven as well. These regional initiatives also occasionally met up nationally in the National Council Lesbian Archives. These archives were grassroots initiatives run by women who often had no archival or library training, but who simply felt the need to conserve both older lesbian history and the lesbian history that was in the making in the flourishing lesbian and gay movement. The Dutch lesbian archives all started out with a remarkably broad collection policy, which was based on recording and making visible the lesbian existence. This emphasis was the result of extensive debates in national meetings of various lesbian archives. During the second national meeting in 1982, the question was put forward what material lesbian material is and who decides. Participants quickly decided that someone's marital status or the explicit knowledge about with whom they shared a bed were no criteria. A subgroup stressed the need to gather everything in order to not be beholden to time-bound interpretations. Another subgroup argued that they also wanted to collect those material that, quote, could have been a push in the right direction, such as the Beauvoir, and also anti-literature by men, end of quote. One of the subgroups brainstormed broader terms to use, such as independent women, free women, autonomous women, consciously autonomous women, or unmarried women, and wondered whether if they would use such terms, they could still present themselves as lesbian archives, because these women did not consider themselves to be lesbians. Eventually, however, the lesbian archives arrived at the notion of the lesbian existence. This was inspired by Adrienne Rich theories on the lesbian continuum. In the newsletter of the Lesbian Archive Leeuwarden, it was explained, quote, "By lesbian existence, we mean the breaking through into other ways of living and women's resistance against imposed male domination. In other words, the existence of lesbians throughout the centuries and of women who in one way or another chose each other to be life partners or allies," end of quote. This meant that the category of lesbian did not only pertain to sexual orientation, but also to any resistance women put up against the heteropatriarchy. The Lesbian Archive Leeuwarden gives some examples of this. Quote, "By this we mean the bonds between mothers and daughters, the friendships between girls and women like the Bedouins who, far from marriage and church with their Christian opinions, formed living communities. They made their own livings, had schools for girls, and left their possessions to the community and not to their family members. It also meant women who, risking life and freedom, illegally had an abortion and women who helped with this. They took the law in their own hands and did not automatically accept the role that was or is assigned to the woman. In the patriarchal history, there have been many deep friendships between married women who, because of the economic and or societal pressure, stepped into the institute of marriage. Through these many forms of both empowering tensions between women as well as their the history of the lesbian existence is enlarged and enriched. She becomes way bigger than we could have ever expected, end of quote. Using this broad interpretation, the archives were able to claim as much interesting history as possible, thereby showing that lesbian women had not recently been invented, but have been around for a long time. The Lesbian Archives conception of the lesbian existence fit within the broader trend within the Dutch lesbian feminist movement, which had already distanced lesbianism and sexuality. Moreover, there was a broader fascination in the Dutch lesbian feminist movement to seek out this historical continuity. For instance, in 1979, women of the lesbian feminist group Lesbian Nation developed the Lesbisch Prachtboek, or the Lesbian Splendor Book, to give both shape to both current lesbian identity formations and to lesbian history, describing ancient matriarchal cultures and witch hunts as part of a longer lesbian historical continuity. The authors argued that this was a way of speaking back to the patriarchal cultural tradition. And in a way, the early lesbian archives continued this aim with their collection policy. This very broad collection policy meant that there were very few formal boundaries drawn to what was collected. Pretty much all of women's history could be interpreted as part of the lesbian existence. This created overlap with the women's archives, specifically in Amsterdam, where the lesbian archive and the women's archives were located in each other's backyards. Both the Lesbian Archive Amsterdam and the International Archives for the Women's Movement collected a lot of women's history. Because the Women's Archive already collected books, their archivist, Mineke Bos, recommended that the Lesbian Archive focus on unpublished materials from consciously lesbian women living in the period from 1920 to 1970. Initially, the Lesbian Archive rejected this idea, as they felt that even though the Women's Archive did collect a lot of the same material, they didn't make it visible as lesbian history because they didn't categorize it as such. Issues of overlap were far less important for lesbian archives elsewhere, such as the Lesbian Archive Leeuwarden, as there was no women's documentation center in the north. As such, they gathered material about the feminist movement and other relevant liberation movements that the lesbian movement intersected with. Aside from a broad focus in content, the archives also had a very broad material collection policy. Maaike Meijer wrote, quote, "What does the Lesbian Archive collect? The answer will make any straight librarian shudder. Everything," end of quote. This meant not just paper archives, books, magazines, and journals, but also ephemeral material, buttons, stencils, t-shirts, posters, photographs, films and video, and importantly, curiosities. In an article about the Lesbian Archive Amsterdam, it was claimed that the archive didn't ever refuse a donation. However, while this was how the archives promoted themselves, in practice it was impossible to gather everything, both in terms of material and subject matter. A member of the Lesbian Archive Utrecht argued that this idea of everything is lesbian and everything relates to everything reached absurd proportions because she felt that took away a certain sort of individuality. This also relates to the idea of collecting all women's history as lesbian history, taking away a specificity here. Similar sentiments were expressed in meetings of the Lesbian Archive Amsterdam, specifically rejecting this idea of collecting curiosities like lesbian hockey sticks or the back numbers of participants of a lesbian ballroom dancing course. As such, there was a difference between the idealistic image of the lesbian archives like to paint of themselves as collectors of everything, and the daily practice where this wasn't seen as viable. Mainly then the archives focused on other kinds of material. They didn't have a lot of money to buy materials as part of an active acquisition policy. Some material was obtained by searching for lesbian books at book markets or flea markets, but most material was donated. A lot of magazines, journals, and books came in, as well as newspaper cuttings that were gathered by friends of the archive. Moreover, in their newsletter, the Lesbian Archive Amsterdam invited lesbian women to donate their old photographs to the photo archive. Here, some limits were given to the broad ideology as well. Quote, "Our interest is not so much in snapshots of things with potentially lesbian color schemes or the smoking barbecue in the abandoned garden of lesbian Johanna, but rather photographs that are a little bit more than personal memory of the people in it, of demonstrations, friend group, friend groups, festivals, graffiti, lectures, and so on, end of quote. In terms of subject matter too, many discussions took place concerning what did and did not belong in the collection. In early meetings, the limits of this ideology were discussed extensively by the Lesbian Archive Amsterdam. In indexing their collection, they wanted to write on the back of index cards why they had certain books. Was the book, the author, or the publisher lesbian? Moreover, in their meetings, they wondered what the plan would be for bisexual women and how to deal with cross-dressing. In response to these debates, the minutes convey a message from Maaike Meijer, who advised to, quote, not pay so much attention to the discussion of what is lesbian and what is not. Collect basic books and make a subcategory of transvestism, and if needed, a subcategory secondary literature, end of quote. Still, staff members kept wondering and debating whether everything written by lesbian authors should be included, even if the subject of the work was not lesbian. The Lesbian Archive Utrecht felt that materials about typically straight subjects could also say a lot about their lesbian authors. Amsterdam, on the other hand, preferred explicit lesbian works. In practice, then, the selection of materials largely came down to the preferences of individual archival staff members. The Lesbian Archive Amsterdam gathered materials in three broad categories: that which is specifically lesbian, that which reflects lesbianism, and that which is appreciated by lesbian women. A good example comes from the newsletter of 1984 from an article named "What is MIEP doing in the Lesbian Archive?" In this article, the archive responded to the question they had been asked repeatedly of what the children's book Miepjes Fantastische Vlechten, or Miepjes Fantastic Braids by author Trude de Jong, was doing in the archive, despite the fact that, quote, neither Miepje nor her fantastic braids play for the other team, end of quote. The archivists argue, quote, according to the Articles of Association, the archive collects everything that is about the life and the experiences of lesbian women in the broadest sense. In practice, this means what one of the directors thinks is lesbian, end of quote. However, as the collection quickly outgrew archival space and it became more and more difficult to keep up with the flourishing lesbian feminist movement, the Lesbian Archive Amsterdam decided to start to become more selective in 1984. In their newsletter, they wrote, quote, our new criterion is that of the passion. That is less broad than the lesbian continuum and broader than the demand of they gotta be doing it with each other. With our new maxim, we hope to give a clear image of what we gather, the archive of passion. We do not want to become too dogmatic, however, and that's why Miepje will remain with us for the time being. In any case, until she has reached the age that passion begins to count. After all, you never know, end of quote. In reality, though, the archive of passion was not much more specific than the Lesbian Existence, and choices of what ought to be included and excluded still were taken mainly on a day-to-day basis, according to the preferences of archivists. In 1987, the policy was explicitly narrowed down when the archive decided to specialize in audiovisual materials, photographs and videos that were made by themselves and by others within the archive active lesbian movement. At the same time, the Amsterdam Archive said in their policy plans that they were focusing specifically on material about, quote, Black, Islamic, disabled and older lesbian women, lesbian girls and bisexual girls, end of quote. However, nothing in their minutes or minutes of meetings or annual reviews shows how they were working towards this goal or what the results of this goal were. This also shows a discrepancy in policy and ideological goals and the daily practice of the archive. In contrast, rather than narrowing down, the Lesbian Archive Leeuwarden expanded even more. In 1983, the archival staff realized that they had mainly been collecting material on the white, middle, and upper class lesbians and decided to change their approach. They became an intercultural information center and started collecting material concerning emancipation in general, rather than only lesbian materials, on basis of a solidarity principle. They gathered material about, for, and by women of color, Jewish women, and women from Eastern Europe. This even broader collection policy fit within this idea of the lesbian existence, seeing the activities of these women as part of their shared fight against the heteropatriarchy. Additionally, in 1987, the archive renamed itself to the Anna Blaman House and also opened their archive and collection to men. In the late 1990s, however, the Anna Blaman House also had to start demarcating their categories, as the lack of subsidies and staff meant that their focus was too broad to keep up with. They decided to no longer collect all materials related to emancipation, but instead focus solely on explicitly pink materials. To conclude, the Dutch Lesbian Archives brought visibility to the lesbian history of the Dutch national landscape. The foundation of these archives gave rise to a large amount of questions around the proportions of lesbian history, what it was and where its boundaries lay. In their collection policy, the Lesbian Archives started out as ever expansive, centered around the lesbian existence. The broad collection ideology and material collection policy were based around the idea that as conceptions of lesbianism might vary between archivists and visitors, as well as change over the years, it was best to just collect everything, withholding personal judgment. This philosophy had a large influence on the open attitude of Dutch lesbian archivists regarding topics that were debated within the broader lesbian community, such as on pornography and sadomasochism. While seemingly inclusive, the construction of the lesbian existence actually created a large role for the archivist's positionality and personal selection, since it was impossible to collect all history belonging to the category. Therefore, the collection policy came down to that which the archivists interpreted as lesbian, and selections were still made behind this unselective policy. When the limits of archival staff as well as archival space eventually called for the narrowing down of collection policy, this coincided with the introduction of processes of professionalization and automation. In my further research, I want to show how, as a result, processes of selection became both more explicit in more narrow collection policies and more implicit, hidden by practicalities and technicalities. I've mainly spoken about collecting material today, but in my research, I also focus on the ways that lesbian archives chose to catalog material and the events they organized to make their collection visible. For instance, while Dutch lesbian archives did collect pornography and sadomasochism, ideological choices still had to be made whether this would be categorized under sexual violence or under sexual liberation. Similarly, the Lesbian Archive Amsterdam organized women-only events to showcase their collection, and as such debated whether bisexual or trans women would be welcome at these events. These topics also show how choices made by archival staff impacted who was included and excluded in the archive. This in turn has consequences for how and for whom a lesbian past was constructed. Thanks very much for your.
Thank you, Noah, for that fascinating talk. Yeah, I'm just there's some applause there virtually and in person. So thank you very much. If anybody has any questions for Noah, if you can hold that thought for the moment, put it in the chat if you want to, or make a note of it. And we are going to go straight on to Liz Millwood's paper now before moving to a discussion after that. So Liz, I'll hand over to you now.
Thanks very much. And I'm going to also attempt to share my screen. There, is that visible? All right, so thank you very much, Noah. That was absolutely fascinating and I really enjoyed it. I can't wait to hear the comments and the questions that people have. I'm talking about finding lesbians in the past in a different way because I'm focusing more on a present intervention into finding lesbians in the past. And don't seem to be able to make my screen advance. Oh, there we go. I don't know what happened there. Sorry, apologies. So I want to start with a quote from Audre Lorde. So in 1984, Audre Lorde wrote that the generation gap is an important social tool for any repressive society. If the younger members of a community view the older members as contemptible or suspect or excess, they will never be able to join hands and examine the living memories of the community. nor ask the all-important question, why? This gives rise to an historical amnesia that keeps us working to reinvent the wheel every time we go to the store for bread. And to add to that, Bia Sander, who's the director of the largest LGBTQI organization in Hungary, has said that, speaking in the context of Hungary, culture is partly constituted by the momentum that the values built by a group are passed on from one generation to the other. In this sense, lesbian culture has not had many possibilities. So in this paper, I would like to suggest that the Rebel Dikes history project, and the broader history project, is important, not just because it's preserving the histories of a previous generation that are in danger of being lost, but because the project and the way it's been designed provides techniques to provoke intergenerational connection and discussion that may mitigate some of these effects of the repressive effects of the generation gap and create simultaneously possibilities to build culture. There are some other innovative lesbian history projects going on. We've got Kate Charlesworth's graphic memoir, which is amazing, if anyone's had a chance to look at that. There's a film that's 10 years old now, Lesbiana, A Parallel Revolution, which is about a community in Canada and North America. And then there's currently a kind of online lesbian bar project, interactive lesbian bar project called Last Butch, which again, some of you may have encountered. So these are all innovative ways to communicate about lesbian history, but they haven't, the way they're set up isn't the same. So they're not able to create these kind of present day opportunities to create some kind of intergenerational community or some kind of space for lesbians to get together or for dykes to get together. So in terms of the Rebel Dikes history project itself, the documentary, the 2021 documentary Rebel Dikes has proved a hit with audiences, both in person and online, around the UK and beyond the UK. Directed by Harry Shanahan and Sean Williams and produced by Siobhan Fahy, the film documents and quite literally animates a period in the late 1980s when a group of London-based lesbians found each other and created a community around their shared interest in BDSM. The film itself, however, is only one outcome of the Rebel Dikes history project, which began in 2014 and is what Fahy styles an archive plus art plus film project. And the stated aims of the project are to, we've got them here, we've got the aims are to stimulate intergenerational debate and community, to inspire lesbian and bisexual women and cis, trans and non-binary, to work with academics to ensure the Rebel Dikes are included in history, to work with artists, musicians, filmmakers and performers to create artworks, and to reignite and reinvent Rebel Dikes community in order to fight isolation amongst younger and older dykes and allies. So given the goals of that project, I want to reflect a bit on how the film and the project presents the process of finding and building lesbian community in the past, and also how the larger project creates ways to find lesbians in the present. So the film itself covers a small group of dykes who were involved in running Chain Reaction, which was a women-only SM night held on Tuesdays at the Market Tavern, which was since demolished, in Nine Elms in London. Although it includes some short sections of footage taken at the time, at lesbian and gay pride marches, at a tense community panel on SM and feminism with Linda Bellos as part of the kind of lesbian sex wars, and in Chain Reaction itself, the majority of the film is based on reconstructions, animations, and talking head interviews. So quite an innovative and creative way to kind of get around the lack of actual archival footage. It also acknowledges that this is just one small section of dyke life at the time, and it's not by any means pretending to be representative of the whole lesbian experience during the period covered by the film. So there's the film, and then there's the larger Rebel Dikes history project. That has several elements. So one was a art and archive show that ran for 3 months in 2021 at the Artists Run Space Station 65 here in London. And the exhibition showed a lot of works, and it showed well-known works from the 1980s and 1990s and early 1990s, which have not really been seen in decades. For example, pieces by Tessa Boffin, Kate Charlesworth, Jill Posner, and Jessica Tanzer, and many others. And it also fostered intergenerational dialogue by inviting younger Dikes to create new works in response to this older material. So Cherry Ahuni, Emily Witham, and Nina Wakeford, and again, many others. So a whole group of new people identifying themselves as Dikes who are engaging with the older material and then creating new works. So a really kind of intergenerational dynamic happening there. And, you know, so you've got a picture of what it sort of looked like there. And then there's also, as if all of that wasn't enough, an archive component of the project, which officially opened in 2019. And that archive component has been receiving donations. So it's been receiving a mix of things, ephemera, documents, photos, videos, and so on. And these are being housed at the Bishopgate Institute in London. And on top of all of that, the project also maintains an online presence. So there's a website, rebeldykeshistoryproject.com, and that presents on that site, you can see some vignettes about the scene and politics of the day, a few audio clips, you know, little bits of oral history clips, and there's also an active Instagram account. So when you think, I mean, in other words, you've got a range of different approaches being taken by the project. And as a whole, the project is finding different ways to animate community engagement beyond the film, although the film itself is this kind of anchor. But before getting into the, you know, thinking about those moments of intergenerational connection, I want to just talk about how the film shows audiences about how Dikes found each other and built lesbian community in the past. So in terms of the accounts given in the film, 2 locations are highlighted as key places that drew this particular subset of Dikes together: Greenham Common Women's Peace Camp and London Squats. And then, of course, in its turn, Chain Reaction Nights then also becomes a space that brings Dikes together. So the main way in which the women talking in the film report finding each other and then finding the scene and creating the scene that they created was via the reputation of these specific locations. So here we've got a picture from Greenham Common. So, Greenham Common. Now I need to go. How do I go back? Rebecca, how do I go back?
Can you not just use the back arrows on your?
It wasn't working. There you go. Yeah. Thank you for your. So this is a picture of Greenham Common Women's Peace Camp. And Greenham Common Women's Peace Camp, as I'm sure the vast majority of you will be aware, it is so famous, generally referred to just as Greenham at the time, was internationally famous. From 1981 to 2000, women occupied the land of Greenham Common Air Base to protest against the presence of American nuclear warheads. The USA held many air bases around the UK after the end of the Second World War, and the UK government agreed to allow the US government to keep nuclear cruise missiles on UK soil. And so the Greenham Common Women's Peace Camp was set up in opposition to that. Women came from all over the UK and from around the world to join the camp, where they lived communally, first in tents, and then, when those were banned by the police, in benders. And they learned a variety of direct action techniques, dealt with locals, dealt with the media, dealt with police, dealt with the military, and obviously had sex and relationships with each other. And then in terms of London squats, Christine Wall points out that squatting, or the occupation of property or land without legal claim, became widespread in London in the 1960s as housing schemes for the working classes designed to replace Victorian terraces failed to materialise. And those council-owned terraces, scheduled for demolition but sitting empty and boarded up for years, as she says, became the sites for direct action, as squatting not only provided homes, but also highlighted the inadequate housing policies of many councils. By the mid-1970s, there were about 30,000 squatters in London, and by the 1980s, councils were willing to semi-legitimise their tenure for the short term. Squatting was a major commitment, with some squats for scores of total strangers, and others with smaller numbers of highly organised people with a clear political vision. And all of them were confronted by police-enforced actions by local councils, such as Lambeth Council, to vandalise and demolish the homes around them. As Wall explains, for those individuals who lived as squatters, and if they had the means to do so, squatting opened a world of possibilities in terms of how to live outside traditional and conventional mores. Women-only squats gave women a chance to explore alternative ways of living and organizing, such as income sharing, consensus building, and imagining what a feminist world would look like, including in sort of literal material terms. Matrix, the influential feminist architecture practice, emerged in part out of members' experiences of living in London squats. Interviewed by Christine Wall, Julia Dwyer stated that through squatting, quote, you become really good at meetings with incredibly different opinions and really different people who aren't all one class, end quote. While Joss Boys said that the experience of squatting, quote, included recognizing and claiming spaces that didn't belong to us, that had been taken from us, and that there was a brilliant coming together of something that I needed to do as a kind of escape or a change or seeing other ways of living than the way I've been brought up, and something that I felt really committed to politically, end of quote. So both Greenham and the London squats were countercultural spaces where their inhabitants created and really lived the alternative ways of being that they sought out. And while accurate details about both types of spaces tended to circulate through personal networks and word of mouth, both were sufficiently troubling to the authorities to get mainstream press coverage. Sometimes it was bemused, sometimes it was very hostile, and sometimes it was quite positive. Both were places where women were living their politics, refusing to conform, refusing to behave, and refusing to be reasonable. Their actions also communicated a faith in the possibility of an alternative future that could be realized in the here and now. This commitment and energy helps to explain why these spaces were the ones that attracted women who felt free enough, for whatever reason, to attempt to live in a different way. And while the mainstream press might have labeled them as man-hating lesbians for having the audacity to live outside of the patriarchal settings, the idea that these were the types of places where lesbians congregated did lead other women to attempt to move there to find these lesbians as well, depending on taste, to find punk rock and drugs. But then I do want to note that there were additional ways to find lesbian community and to create it at the time. Obviously, because the Rebel Dikes film is not pretending by any means to represent all types of lesbian community building at the time. Greenham Common is justly famous as the place where the truly committed underwent their rite of passage, and London is always seen as the centre of the culture and politics that really matters. But lesbian spaces did exist outside of London. So in 1986, for example, the year before Chain Reaction opened, a West Midlands lesbian and gay newspaper in the Pink shared an announcement calling all lesbians to your very own girls only club. For 60p, lesbians could gain admission to the Silver Web in Wolverhampton, where Heineken Lager was still only 75p. And at the Birmingham Lesbian and Gay Community Centre, there was an older lesbian get-together every Friday evening and a young lesbian group meeting on the first Saturday afternoon of the month. And I do want to note that there's no intergenerational mixing in that setup, and there's arguably a reason for that. So in the 80s, for sure, there was fear around ages of consent and of being seen as a predatory lesbian, and there's always generalized ageism, which goes in both directions. So the lack of intergenerational connection between lesbians makes sense in the context. Information about where to find lesbians was available through the newsletter of the centre, as it was through many other such centres in the provinces. And in addition to what were billed as national phone lines, including London Lesbian and Gay Switchboard, London Lesbian Line, and the Lesbian and Gay Youth Movement phone line, there were local telephone helplines which provided up-to-date local information on events and meeting places, such as a lesbian disco in Leamington Spa, as well as support, for example, through Birmingham Lesbian Line, North Staff's Lesbian Line, and the various local Friend phone lines, such as Friend Coventry or Friend West Midlands. So Friend was a national, I mean, Friend still exists, but Friend was a national network, which exists, as its handbook for 1984 explained, to offer counselling, information and befriending to people who encounter problems in relation to their sexuality, end of quote. And Friend volunteers offered support in 5 main ways: through telephone contact, through face-to-face contact, through letter writing, through befriending, and through social groups. So it was quite a comprehensive network. In other words, there were in fact, many ways to meet lesbians from different classes and ages and backgrounds, in addition to Greenham and through the squatting community in London. But the point about those places is they have a kind of mythic status that then becomes incredibly important. And by foregrounding the dominance of those iconic spaces, and Chain Reaction, because it's London's, first lesbian SM club, takes its rightful place alongside them, the Rebel Dikes film draws our attention to the power of place and the significance of a particular kind of space in creating a very specific version of community, which then everyone else kind of thinks about themselves in relation to. Michigan Women's Music Festival is a similarly iconic place in North American lesbian history. So Fahy and the Rebel Dikes project quite rightly seek to record and represent their own contribution to lesbian history and to ensure that history is not lost. But it's also part of the beauty of the project is it gets you thinking about what other spaces exist and other ways in which lesbians were finding each other at the time. So that's at the time. But then if we think about now, the film and the project is very clear. It's talking about a specific group of dykes in London, not all dykes, not all lesbians, not all gay women from the era, but through its screening practices and the kind of broader project, it's creating bridges across different segments of the community to help them find each other now in the present, in the absence of those mythical spaces from the past. So the term Rebel Dikes was coined for the project, and it's obviously a bit of a redundant. So at the time, these and other similar lesbians were simply dykes, a term of abuse reclaimed by members of the community, and that self-fashioning as a dyke distinguished them as simultaneously embracing an outsider status and rebelling against or rejecting their perception of what it meant to be gay, to be het, or even sometimes to be lesbian, to the extent that at that time, the word lesbian could be associated with middle-class professional women, such as social workers or government employees. And those were two, career options which provided women with careers and independence before the Conservative government of Thatcher gutted government funding. But as Alice Coffin has pointed out, in relation to the use of the term lesbian genius, which is the title of her 2020 book, and a term used by the organization, the Euro Central Asian Lesbian Community, to refer to lesbian activists, the genius of deliberately coining a phrase such as lesbian genius or Rebel Dikes is that people start using it and start thinking about it. It's a way to impose a political agenda, such as increased visibility or such as insisting on our history, our complex history, without the requirement for anyone to have to read an ideological tract or, plow through a 400-page history book. Given this, the use of dyke in the title is significant. It's not just historically accurate. Of course, the women in the film were generally known at the time as the SM Dikes, but it works in two other ways. It's highly visible. To talk about the film, one has to use the title after all, and it insists on that earlier form of reclaiming, which matters today as a newer generation of women may be unaware or even resistant to the idea that this word is not simply a slur, because that's one of the things that gets forgotten, is that so-called slurs get reclaimed, and that reclaiming it and being unapologetically proud of being a dyke can feel empowering. Another notable feature of the Rebel Dikes project is that film screenings often occur in community spaces. So the film is available on BFI Player, and anyone who hasn't seen it, I cannot recommend it highly enough. Obviously, I'm talking about it. I cannot recommend it highly enough. It's a very, very thought-provoking, fascinating film. But it's also, so it is available for people to see through the player, but it has also been screened through community spaces, and several of these screenings have been paired with community archiving or community oral history activities, tapping into the desire of attendees to share their own experiences of the past and of the present. And audiences tend to be a mix of generations. So the film is not just playing at art house cinemas or as part of LGBTQ plus film festivals. It's going out into local settings such as libraries, and by going out into those local settings, a cross-section of audience members are able to watch it, and crucially, able to watch it with others in a non-commercial setting. And in that way, it mimics the commonplace practices and experiences of the era which it depicts, where members of the community went to see screenings of whatever depictions of lesbians were available, shared the experience of watching them together, with perhaps some anxiety over knowing when to laugh at the in-jokes, and then debriefed in person afterwards at the pub or in the coach going home if they'd all gone to see a special screening or a special event. Those informal practices contributed to the development of a sense of community and of commonality in difference. So currently, YouTube reaction videos may try to mimic this kind of experience, and they can obviously reach a much larger and globally dispersed audience, but they are fundamentally quite different. And this is from a YouTuber known as Kelsey's Comments. The other massive cultural moment right now is the current iteration of the drag king movement. And drag king performances and workshops are one of the only group community activities that continue to be quite widespread in kind of what we can generally call kind of dyke culture. However, they do tend to attract a fairly narrow audience. They take place in bars and clubs. And on the whole, they do not create in the moment opportunities for an intergenerational dialogue. Now, obviously, there are some drag kings who are from earlier generations, but they tend to be relatively generationally limited. So they are great experiences, but they're not, you know, their goal is not to foster that intergenerational dialogue. So I want to conclude with a few observations. Now, obviously, of course, any documentary necessarily places quite a limited frame around the past, and with the benefit of hindsight and the need to create a watchable film, turns the disorganized chaos of lived experience into a narrative that makes some sort of sense. There are limits to whose voices can be heard now. The challenge for those trying to capture the lesbian past is that present audiences may be unwilling to engage with ideas or perspectives that they cannot map exactly onto their own current ideas of what is, to use the terminology of the 1980s, PC enough. And there's always a challenge about which stories are going to get told, which stories have to be left out, and why, which also sort of speaks back to Noah's points about all those debates going on around which stories should be preserved. And then, of course, which stories can find an audience does depend on multiple factors: the networks and media savvy of the cultural producers, the ability to get funding, the availability of community spaces to show the films or host the exhibitions. So if we think about a film like Lesbiana, which came out 10 years earlier, is covering a similar historical period, also covers the creating of a revolutionary lesbian culture for young dykes in North America, but for a variety of reasons didn't have the same kind of impact that Rebel Dykes is having. And there could be a number of reasons for that. It's a bilingual film. The politics of the film is very different. And of course, 2012 is not 2022. So the kind of social media landscape is very different. But in spite of those kinds of limits that to which stories can be told, I think the film Rebel Dykes and those associated community building elements are working now because of the moment we're in. There is really a hunger for these stories, I think. In a discussion with the geographer Kath Brown and sociologist Marta Olesic about the potential of a reinvigorated lesbian feminism in the present, the geographer Julie Podmore argues that there are currently some projects, at least in Montreal where she's based, that are intergenerational moments of lesbian feminist renewal. And she tends to think that young queers are attracted by the radical critique provided by lesbian feminism, and young lesbians are inspired by the idea of lesbians creating spaces for themselves. Younger lesbians lament the loss of physical spaces to meet, perhaps even more since the impact of the pandemic has shown us that while virtual communications have been life preservers and have made it possible to connect globally and intergenerationally, they are not a substitute for the physical experience of being in the same room with others with whom one shares desires, vision, politics, history, and a sense of what is possible when we come together, and also the ability to have heated debate in a different kind of setting about what should be included, what should not be included, how we all feel about things. There is value in being able to imagine a physical space that's erotic and cultural and has mythical status, but there is a completely different value in being able to actually occupy it or create it afresh in these new ways. Marta Olesic, from her position in Poland, suggests that there is no one resistance really, but I see the 1980s as the greatest time of lesbian visibility and audibility, and hope it will be continuously revisited, end of quote. The danger of the generation gap for lesbians is the perception that there is nothing to learn from the recent past, and even while we may enjoy watching Gentleman Jack. But the recent past, even across the digital divide, does have valuable lessons for building community today, especially around how ephemeral it is, how sexy it is or is not, how full of conflict and fury it is, and that really comes across well in the film, and how splintered we can be, and we usually are, and how much lesbians fought and still fight to change the world. Thank you. That's me. And there are my references, if you're interested.
Thank you, Liz. That was fascinating, absolutely fascinating. So we are going to move now to discussion and questions. If anybody has any questions immediately, please feel free to raise your hand or